Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this Q&A for the documentary film Mayor. I'm Anand from the FilmBath Festival. I'm a broadcaster based in Bath in the UK. And this Q&A is hosted by AMPLIFY, a collaborative online festival. We hope you're enjoying it so far. I'm, of course, really pleased to welcome David Osit, director of Mayor. David, welcome. It's really nice to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Just before we start, David, just a really quick reminder to our audience, because of course we want to know what questions people have about the film. So if you have any comments, questions, anything you want to ask tonight, just pop them into the chat function here, or you can also tweet them if you use the handle @AmplifyFilm. And of course, we'll get in as many of those questions as we can. David, I'm assuming everyone's watched the film, but I find it helps me a little bit to have a really quick summary. So obviously, the film follows the mayor of Ramallah, a Christian Palestinian man. His name is Musa Hadid. He's very quiet. He's unassuming. He has a wife and kids, and he likes music and fountains. It starts before Christmas in 2017. And Ramallah is an interesting place. You'll tell us more about it, but it's not a very big city, about 57,000 people, mix of Christian and Muslim, 10 miles south of Jerusalem, and surrounded really on all sides by Israeli settlements. It's also the de facto capital of the Palestinian Authority. So first of all, David, why did you make this film? I mean, you could make a lot of films about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Why this one? Why the focus on the mayor of Ramallah?
Well, I'd spent a bunch of time in the Middle East before I got into filmmaking. Even I was studying refugee law in American University in Cairo, and spent a lot of time working there and studying there, traveling. And as I got into filmmaking, I was working as an editor briefly for a Palestinian director on this documentary called Off Frame. And that documentary's edit was in Ramallah. And so I went to Ramallah, and it had been a couple of years since I'd been there. And I was really struck, at least to my eyes, how much the city had changed. And it seemed like all of a sudden there were hipster bars and nightclubs, and the city had free unlimited public Wi-Fi, and there was a Jaguar dealership, and this vibrant nightlife with the Christmas celebrations and the Easter parades and all these things. And I kept thinking to myself, even as someone who'd spent a lot of time in the Middle East, I couldn't shake the fact that I was finding some incongruence with, as a North American, this expectation of what Middle Eastern cities should look like. And I felt really like challenged and provoked in a good way by this feeling of like, wow, even though I've spent so much time here, I can still be so surprised just because it feels so incongruous with what my understanding of this part of the world is. And I think in North America particularly, we're given a very one-dimensional understanding of what images out of this part of the world can be. And
we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I just want to throw in a couple of things, because there's some really sweet little flourishes in the scenes that we see of Ramallah, like the smiley faces on the traffic lights, and there's one coffee shop called Stars and Bucks, and there's just these lovely little touches. What was your pitch to Musa Hadid when you went to say, I want to follow you around and make a film about you? Like, this guy's an engineer and he's not flashy. So what was his reaction?
well, I came into his office and I told him, listen, I think your city is fascinating. I think your city's fascinating, and I feel and felt prior to even making this pitch to him that if I could bring a handful of Americans or North Americans or Westerners into Ramallah, that it would change their complete perception of what this part of the world is, and also deepen perhaps their understanding of what the quote unquote Israel-Palestinian conflict is. I was just so intrigued by it, but I was also compelled by this one question, which is what I told him, which was and I think this is true for all the films I make, is that I'm compelled by a question and I don't know how to answer the question, so I have to make the movie. And the question was, how do you run a city when you don't have a country? How do you run a city in the shadow of an occupation? And I also told him during this pitch, essentially, that as an American, this was 2017, as an American, I perhaps was at my lowest point of having faith in my electoral system, only to be matched by the present moment. And I remember feeling this sort of sense of, wow, I mean, you are an elected official in Palestine. You are one of the only elected officials in Palestine. uh, the idea of civic government and your relationship to your citizens, and the idea of power and the ability to have power but also to be denied power and to be denied autonomy. I was fascinated in the minutia of what his work would be. How do you manage civic pride? How do you maintain civic duties when the idea of even existence is a political act?
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about that imagery that you wanted to push back against. I mean, the film kind of opens like this, like 1950s, like wistful Christmas musical or something. I mean, for a moment I thought, wait, is this a documentary? You've got the mayor sitting in what looks like a charming little French cafe. It's actually across from City Hall where his office is. And then the first 10, 15 minutes of the film, we follow him around and he's doing that mundane stuff that city officials do. He's dealing with dumpster fires, he's dealing with school plumbing, planning permissions. And I have to confess to you that about 10 minutes in I was thinking, I don't know if I can continue to watch this. And that feeling didn't last, but it was really interesting because, and then I thought, oh, maybe that's kind of the point. This is what this man does. Is that what you were trying to achieve with the opening of the film?
It was. I mean, I didn't necessarily want people to want to turn their screens off by 15 minutes, but I find the first 15 minutes of the film funny. And I wanted to convey that humor. And to me, even the opening scroll of the film, I'm trying to show you as an audience that this is not what you think it's going to be. This isn't going to be feeding into one-dimensional tropes as to what the Middle East looks like, and it's going to take you far away. And the music's a big part of that for me too. The music in this film was just as conscientious of a choice as any editing or any scenes that I have, and that I'm trying to put in gestures to an audience to show you have to follow a much smaller story than the Israel-Palestine
Mm,
issue here. You're following a fable. I'm putting you into a simple story in a complex place. And it's not going to be about Israel or Palestine or politics or borders. It's going to be about a man who's trying to work on his city. And what does he
yeah.
have to reckon with? And what does he have to struggle with? And my hope for an audience is that I hope it matches my own personal experience in Ramallah in the time that I spent there, which is, I think when I first saw things like the Christmas celebrations before I even started making the film, I remember asking a Palestinian friend of mine, why is Christmas such a big deal here? And his response was like, well, Jesus was born like right there. Like he's a hometown hero. And also, like, that humor aside, like, I think by the end of the film, when you have the fountain, which is of course a big central metaphor in the movie, and the Christmas, tree lighting and all these things, I think you realize by the end of the film that these aren't empty gestures and just simple, banal things. These are actually small acts of resistance,
Mm.
because again, uh, these are activities that are conducted for a city to feel as though it can have a normal life, which is continuously denied under military occupation.
So you're absolutely right. It is funny because one of the first scenes is he's kind of, and you don't expect this, and that is what kept me watching. It was very compelling. He's in a meeting discussing branding for Ramallah. I mean, that is funny. And instead of seeing an intifada or Hamas and Fatah or political rallies, we are seeing Santas and tree lighting. And I mean, there isn't really a small town anywhere in the West that can't relate to this.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, you said it well. I think this idea of being able to relate to it was really provocative to me. I didn't want people to feel like they had to have a PhD, to understand what was going on here, which is why I'm leaving a lot of those details out. And um, I mean, I guess to go a little deeper, I mean, I liked how you noticed from the film that you mentioned that the French cafe, the Café de la Paix, is across from City Hall, and I think you know that because the film kind of takes place in this 2 square block radius, and I wanted to give a sense of the geography to an audience so that they can feel it as though they've been there. And I think that that's something that I think a film has a power to do that other kinds of media can't. And I wanted the film to not be reductive, but to be relatable. And I feel like that's a very fine line in documentary filmmaking, especially I have to acknowledge my own outsider status. And so when I would make the film, I would only stay for a couple weeks at a time and come back to New York where I live and go back and forth. I needed to keep the city fresh for me. And I needed to never forget that I was an outsider making this film. I'm not Palestinian, but I was making the film of Ramallah through Musa's eyes. And I really saw him as a collaborator on this film. I would talk to him regularly and ask him, what are you interested in? What do you think is most special about your city? What do you want to share? And I think, you can hopefully tell from the film that, I mean, he really understands what I'm trying to do, because we're essentially trying to do the same thing. Musa's trying to rebrand his city and appeal to Western audiences, and I'm making the film to appeal to Western audiences. It's not my role to make a film for Palestinians. It's to make a film for people who've never been and maybe need to understand a little bit more to feel like they understand more about what kind of world we live in.
There's some beautiful moments. There's one where they're in the car and they're discussing how, our problem is we think the whole world can't sleep at night because of what's going on here. There's another moment where the mayor says I think he turns to you. I think he says, David, do you think people in the U.S. know who we are? So there are these really beautiful moments where he almost directly speaks to the audience.
Yeah, I think those moments are really important to me because I take again to follow this metaphor of the film being more like a fable. I liked these moments where there are stand-ins for the idea of what a group represents. And I think that moment, for example, where Musa turns to me and asks me that question, I think I kind of represent you as an audience. I think in that moment, he's looking at you as a viewer and saying, do your friends know what's happening here? Do you, as a viewer, do you understand any of this? And that moment was very moving for me to film it,
It's
because
almost, David, it's almost like he's saying, do I matter? Do we matter? It's not even just, do you know who we are, but do we matter? I mean, that I think was why it was so powerful.
and there's this horrendous political narrative over the last several decades of even just challenging the idea that Palestinian people exist in the first place, and the idea that Palestine exists and that they deserve anything, that they deserve any rights of return or any rights of sovereignty or land ownership or things of that nature. And that continues, of course, to this day. And so I think those moments are really powerful because the idea of physical place is a really important element of this film. I feel like I've seen lots of films about the occupation that reckon with the more obvious costs of the occupation. Of course, the moral cost, but also the in terms of death or in terms of conflict, literal conflict. I was really curious, what if I can make a film that shows you the banal costs of occupation, which are all the more terrifying because they wash over an entire population repeatedly. And for example, that scene of violence that I'm filming towards the end of the film, when there's this attack on City Hall, which is of course by this point a metaphor for lots of things in the film in terms of this idea of Musa's vision of the city, and it's literally under duress in this moment. When after that scene happened, I remember the next day early in the morning thinking, this is going to be a really busy shoot day. I'm going to go to the mayor's office. Everyone's going to be talking about what happened here last night. I'm sure it's just going to be the talk of the town. And I get to the office the next day and I walk up to Musa's office and he says to me, David, we've got to go check out the school. They've got new doors. We've got to go, see how they're doing. And no one mentioned it. I mean, and I think that was a really educational moment for me of just, yeah, I can't help what I'm bringing into this. Occupation is not something I've grown up with. It's not something that I've had to endure in a way that, like, I have to weather the storm of this constant challenge to my identity and the entire world being convinced that my identity is not meaningful and not deserving of equal rights and equal status. So to have that moment was this horrific and also comic, but darkly comic reminder of sometimes the costs of occupation are much smaller and
Yeah.
much more inconspicuous.
So let's talk about, the big thing that happens in the film. And I'm sure you had no idea, it just happened, which was Donald Trump announcing that the US Embassy would move to Jerusalem, a city that's claimed by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, effectively kind of completely sidestepping any peace process and saying we stand with the Israelis. Um, did you guys really hear the news from a visitor? I mean, why didn't he have cable and a radio? I mean, in that moment, I was thinking, wow, yeah, this is a man he hasn't got the trappings of the office. He's just dealing with the just the mundane realities. Was there a reason for that? Is it just that he doesn't have that stuff?
Well, to be fair, that news took everyone by surprise. I mean, I
Yeah,
didn't know either. I
yeah,
mean, that moment where Musa's priest comes into the office and tells him that it was news to all of us, and it happened very suddenly. Um, and I'll say also in Musa's defense, he's extremely busy. Like there is so much work that goes into running a city like Ramallah. I'm sure that's true of almost any mayor, but this was 8:30 in the morning. This was the beginning of the day, but yeah, it was also the fifth day of filming, and it took all of us by surprise. And I remember on the fourth day of filming thinking to myself, I'm filming all these municipal meetings and talks about the flash mob and Christmas tree, but I'm really wondering, because I think it's inevitable, I'm really wondering when the occupation will assert itself, because Ramallah is a special kind of city. It's unique among cities in the West Bank. It's one of the only places in the West Bank you can go to where if you kind of squint, you can maybe not see the signs of the occupation. And that's not to say it's not extraordinarily present. And this is only one view of Ramallah. There are also refugee camps surrounding Ramallah. There are settlements surrounding Ramallah. This is again Musa's story about Musa's version of Ramallah.
yeah.
But it's a very complicated city despite its size. And it's there's so much nuance to it that I really wanted to focus on uh how does this city function when when there's no other edifice that will help it function.
Mm. And then as a result of that news, again, it's interesting, I think we've all seen dozens and dozens of stories over the years that feature Israeli soldiers and, Palestinians throwing rocks, but it was different seeing it through his eyes. You see him suddenly out and about in the city and everything's changed. And then again, we see him grappling with, again, the problems that the occupation brings. They don't have a sewage treatment plant. It took 15 years to get a cemetery. I mean, those aren't details that get reported very much. I wouldn't have known that.
Precisely, and I feel like that's what I mean when it comes to looking at the other the way underneath the obvious elements of occupation and what effects it has. Things like when Usa travels to Oxford and makes the speech and on Oxford for the sister city twinning arrangement in that scene, the things he's saying are things that we talked about. I was like, Musa, a lot of people outside of Palestine don't know that you have to use Israeli currency. That's something you should tell people. It's something that it's and we've talked about that a lot, and things like that were just it's I think when you're living inside of an occupation, you don't necessarily see what
Mm.
is or is not clear to outsiders. What becomes obvious, of course, are the things that you were talking about having seen before: soldiers and rock throwing and those things and these larger acts of resistance. But yeah, I was really interested, and I think following a mayor and a municipal government gave me the freedom to be able to report on these other elements of what the occupation imposes, because how else could we share them unless we're
I,
focusing on these micro stories?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I was just going to say that one of my favorite scenes in the film, I think because it almost like cuts to the heart of what, the trap that Musa and all the people in these occupied territories are in, is when the German delegation comes and the Germans are kind of saying, you need to negotiate with these people who will not give you permission, and it's like they're having to like boil it down and say, but you cannot just give away your dignity. There's no that what there's actually a line, I made a note of it. You cannot negotiate dignity, something like that. That's dignity is not negotiable, the mayor says. But in that scene, finally, they are having to explain to these, lovely, well-meaning, comfortable outsiders, what it's like every day. And I really thought that scene was powerful. It was a little bit like, you know, it reminded me a little bit like a court scene where you might have a judge questioning a rape victim and saying, but why did you do that? And I don't mean to make that direct comparison. I'm not making a political point, but it was just a very powerful scene about the imbalance of power.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite scenes in the film too, because I think that I think I'd like to think that this film holds people really safely who maybe don't have the same opinions as me, or maybe are newer to the issue. And I think some people inevitably are asking themselves that question: why can't Palestinian people just, you know, accept that this is what it is and meet the other side as though it's their duty to? And I think a lot of people, especially well-meaning liberal people, would agree with a lot of what those German people are saying. And it was really incredible for me to hear Musa and his colleagues' dignified response to those to that commentary, because I think it's the sort of thing where you maybe you roll your eyes at times in terms of thinking about, well, how idealistic this solution proposed by these outsiders is. But this is what we've been asking Palestinians to do for decades.
Yeah. David, I've got a question from someone who's watching the Q&A at the moment. This is from Sophia. She says, thank you for giving us such an important insight. How long did you spend following the mayor around? And how true to life is the final version compared to what you actually observed? It did feel like it could have been a lot more dramatic than you portray in the film.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the first answer was off and on for about a year and a half. I would go for a month, come back for a few weeks, go back for a month, etc. I was a one-person band for this film, so there was no one else shooting with me. It was just me. I had a couple, friends who would help out sometimes in Ramallah, but I was working alone, which meant that I had to do a lot and come home and work on editing sample reels for fundraising and things like that. So that over about a year and a half, and the film. It's an interesting question. I think the film is. I think any film I would ever make actually has to have some sort of an autobiographical experience of what my own experience of discovery was, because the films that I'm trying to make, especially this one, are in pursuit of understanding something for myself. And I think that journey is what informs what the film ends up being. So this film was really just me working towards this effort of trying to answer that question that I initially set out to answer. And I actually saw the interplay between the dramatic and the banal as being the core of what was special about following Musa in this story. Before I even started filming him, I knew that the film would be funny in a certain way, but also darkly funny, and that dark humor would reveal some deep tragedies, and in the sense of like the best kinds of satire, in that satire works when the rules are broken, and then what's left when the rules that we are accustomed to breaking. And the rules breaking here in the case of this film, for example, is that there's this attack on City Hall, but Musa's concerned because there's rocks in the fountain. And what does that mean, and what does that represent? So for me, that whole journey of making the film and threading the balance between the more maybe forward palette, salacious elements, and the dramatic elements of what this film could have been. It was vital to make sure that they were interplaying with the banal in
Okay,
this movie.
David, sorry, I'm going to just stop you because I've got a
Sure.
couple more questions. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just want to make sure we get these in. Ruth says, excellent film. Were there any impacts of the filmmaking itself? So, i.e. the fact that you had outsiders with the camera paying attention to certain situations. What were the difficulties that you faced while filming?
I think it's inevitable that my presence, it matters. I don't tend to trust filmmakers who think of themselves as invisible or as a fly on the wall. But I think that impact is what I tried to hint at in that scene where Musa turns to camera and addresses me. Uh, I think you're probably, if that scene wasn't in the film, I think at a certain point you'd be wondering to yourself, what is the, like, why is this film, why does it exist? Who's making it? Like, what's this like? who's this for? Why has this access been given? What's going on here? But I think that film, that scene rather, does something else that we didn't talk about, which is hint at this idea of people want to be seen. People want to be heard. And I don't think anyone appears or agrees to be in a documentary unless they have something that they want to say, or they feel as though their voice is not being amplified. And so I mean, I think that this film by nature was an extension of that core need that we all have.
Now, you touched on this a bit, but Richard is asking, when it comes to the film's comedy, was that tone planned from the beginning, or was it something that you actually found once in the shooting or in the editing process?
It was planned from the beginning, and not only that, I would I filmed about 350 hours of footage for this film, a lot of which, to be honest with you, is like very dry municipal meetings. And I would approach a lot of these scenes with this in mind, with this idea of like, how can I find the humor here? How can I find the weariness of what Musa has to experience? I can't tell you how many shots I have of Musa just being stressed out, of, of Musa just trying to hold it together because of all the stuff that he's got to deal with.
Yeah.
And I mean, the first thing I ever heard him say before our meeting began, our first meeting, he was on a phone call with one of his constituents, and he was talking to them, and in Arabic, and he was saying, like, listen, like, I can't help you get out of this parking ticket. I told you to stop parking there. Like, this is like, I'm the mayor. I'm not, I'm not the chosen one. I'm the mayor. Like, I can't do everything for you. And I think even when I heard that, before I even made the pitch to him, I was like, this confirms everything I thought this film would be, which is it's going to be about sort of a beleaguered public official who's doing his best, but also in the vein of like a Gary Cooper character from like the golden age of Hollywood, who's the sort of white hat sort of character, from a Western in some ways.
There are other great moments. There's the one where the guy takes a selfie and then says that, if they don't like you, they can all go to hell, or whatever it was. And he's like, how many people are going to see? There's just some really lovely moments. The other one where one of his city councilors says, we should put Jerusalem as our capital on the Christmas tree. And he says, we are not the Palestinian leadership. I mean, he's got a real core to him, and I think that's what helps. I want to talk to you about the outside world in this film, because not only do you have Donald Trump deciding Middle East policy, on the spur of the moment, you've got Prince William visiting, which is its own, kind of geopolitical thing. And you've got those scenes where Musa goes to Washington and Bonn and Oxford. And I just wonder if you can tell us, what you saw through his eyes. I mean, we see it, but when you were there filming, what did you see through his eyes, of this outside world, and the way that it interacts with this problem, with this occupation and this issue of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and what happens?
I don't mean to speak for Musa, but I think if he were here, he'd probably agree. I think Musa's tired of pitching. I think Musa's tired of, and I think a lot of Palestinians are tired of trying to pitch their case to the rest of the world. And I think that comes across. I think, to me, the scene with Prince William, what it's almost summed up in the context of this is a visit for sports. One of his city council members says this is a visit for him to look at the football teams. And I think there's so much to admire about what so many people in the world are attempting to do in order to bring awareness to Palestine, and to raise awareness for what's going on, and to do cross-cultural programming and things of that sort. And these are all very valuable things. But Musa is the mayor of the city of Ramallah. He's trying to clean the roads. He's trying to build a sewage treatment plant. He's trying to provide for services for his people. He also ends up being in this ambassador role. And I think, not to be terribly cynical, but I think he's able to do this in part because he's he wears a suit. He's Christian. He speaks English well. He can travel and be this ambassador of what the West wants Palestine to look like. But the West rejects Palestine anyway. And I think that there's something very frustrating in that. And I tried to hint at his frustration as much as I could, without it being and it's not as though he's you know this stuff all still matters. It's still extremely still important to honor uh, to honor what people are trying to do in terms of bringing awareness and everything. But his role as an ambassador, I don't think it's what any mayor signs up for.
Mm, mm. David, I've got another question from the audience. This one's from Matt, and it says the small details in the documentary are evocative of everyday concerns that people have everywhere. Do you think that this will help people relate to the people of Ramallah? And I was going to ask you. I mean, you have shown this film in the U.S. What was the reaction? Did people relate because they could relate to Musa?
I believe so. I mean, I had one screening. The film premiered at a festival, a wonderful documentary festival in the U.S. called True False Film Festival, which is in the American heartland, Columbia, Missouri. But people come from all over to attend it, and it was the last film festival to proceed as scheduled in the world before the pandemic hit. So this was in the first week of March, and there were 1,400 Midwesterners, standing and cheering at the end of the film for the fountain, and for Musa and for the city that they didn't know anything about but fell in love with. And I can't tell you how many people would come up to me afterwards and just say, I had no idea about anything in this movie. And it really struck me. I think I was wary at the beginning of the editing process of like how much of the relation points will be because of cultural relativism, like insisting on this idea that you should care because there are Christians here, or you're Christian, or you should care because he wears a suit and you wear a suit, things like we were just talking about. But I also think there's something, the next iteration of that idea, the important element of that idea to me is that I don't think media gets to really show complexity in this part of the world. And I think that we care about things when we ask questions about things and when we're curious about things. I believe that's the first step towards understanding something. And I also believe that just in general, this is more American centric, but I think Americans are almost entirely indifferent to suffering, but they deeply care about injustice. And I was thinking about how can I frame the film as a story of injustice rather than a story of suffering. And I think that inherent in that idea is the idea of dignity. And that's not something I've seen depicted a lot in this part of the world.
That's a wonderful note to end on, because I think, given the backdrop of the film and also what we've seen in America in the last couple of weeks amidst this polarization, both a film and an opportunity to understand something that is complex and is contentious. David, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and answering all these questions. Really lovely film. Mayor, if you haven't seen it and you watch the Q&A, please do watch it. And please remember that you can watch lots of other films on AMPLIFYFilm.org. We've got all the programs. I also want to thank our BSL interpreter, Wendy, for doing such a brilliant job. You can also share feedback, please, on social media. Use the handle @AmplifyFilm. David will know, we all know, at this really, really crazy time, film festivals need all of the support that they can get. So thanks to all of you for joining us. David, thank you very much. Wendy, thank you, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.